Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of the ATACS podcast. That's Adults Talk About Cool Stuff, and we are indeed here to talk about some cool stuff today. The date is October 25th, 2023. I am your host. I am Flex from Raleigh, North Carolina. Joining me today, we have Paul from Atlanta, Georgia. How are you today, Paul?
I'm ready to bare my soul to the internet to speak on things that are significant to me. So I'm doing fantastic. Thank you, Flex.
That sounds pretty great. Any day you can bare your soul to the internet is a great day, I think.
Not really, but carry on.
Also joining us, we have Nate from Clayton, North Carolina.
Yep. Hi, I am here as well. I have no bears.
We also have Will from Wendell, North Carolina.
Thanks for listening.
And last but not least, we have Garrison adrift on the sea of memories. Thanks for joining us, sir.
It's going to get raw, y'all. Get the tissues out, because we're going to be crying by the end.
Mm-hmm. And so today is going to be, as Garrison alluded to, a little bit more of a personal trip down memory lane, so to speak. The title of this episode is My Perfect Console. And normally on our podcast we deep dive into a game or discuss various cool stuff that we have been involved with. But today we're going to be looking back at some video games that have been meaningful to us. The title of this episode this is inspired from an actual podcast called My Perfect Console, which is hosted by a fellow named Simon Parkin. And you can find his podcast on whatever your podcast listening service of choice is, iTunes, Apple, Google Podcasts, whatever. It's pretty readily available. But we thought it would be fun to try our hand at this. So we thought it was a really cool idea that Simon does on his podcast. And to explain what that format is, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Will to explain what we're doing here today.
All right. So yes. As Flex mentioned, it's a podcast about games that have been, that have been influential and memorable for the individuals that he brings on to the show. They usually pick 5. One thing we won't do that they do on the podcast is sort of a snippet from one of the memorable songs from whatever the game was. So maybe you'd say, Mario, and then the Mario theme would play. But we're going to dodge that because of copyright concerns. But we're still going to talk about why these games are significant to us. We're going to go through 5 apiece, kind of one person's 5, the next person's 5, on and on until we get to number 1, unless there's some overlap, which may complicate things a little bit. And then talk about why these games are significant to us. And then I don't know if we're going to do this part or not, but it seems like we name the console. Is that right, Flex, at the very end?
Yep. So usually on Simon's podcast at the end of each episode on his podcast, each episode is one guest, and that guest gives 5 games. And they kind of tie it into their life story and everything. Obviously, we have 5 people. We're not going to have time to dive into everyone's life story here, so we're just going to be focused on the games. But yes, he does ask them if they want to name the console. If you don't have a name, that's fine. But it is a fun little thing at the end.
Right. There you go. But I think that's a good enough explanation to orient someone to know a little bit about what they're doing and what they're hearing.
Yeah. So yeah. As Will said, each of us has selected 5 video games that are meaningful to us, and we'll give a quick little shout out and kind of a explanation as to why we chose each game. So we'll take turns going around, and hopefully this is an enjoyable trip, nice trip down memory lane, reflecting on some of the games that were meaningful to us. And maybe even shed a tear or two along the way, as Garrison said. We'll see. But to start us off, Garrison made the decision that we are generally going through these games from oldest to newest. So we will also start with our oldest member on the panel here, which Will is delighted about that he gets to start us off. So, Will, what is your first game you would like to talk to us about today? You would like to share with us?
It's a little known game. You guys probably aren't familiar with it. It's called The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with this. It was released by a little company called Nintendo in
Never heard of it.
1992. Um, so yeah, up until A Link to the Past came out, I played a couple mystery games on my computer and got stuck almost immediately, like playing like Myst or something. And then I played like sports simulators, like Tony La Russa Baseball 2. But to me, one of the first times I actually got into sort of like a fantasy world, was playing A Link to the Past. And of course, at the time, I didn't have many games. It was just sort of, I only had like 2 or 3 games on the Super Nintendo, and I had an old Nintendo player's guide for the game, and it was totally falling apart, and there were pages of it all over my basement that had fallen out of the book. And it was such a dense game. You were bouncing between the light world and the dark world, and there were little tricks and things you had to kind of piece together to kind of figure out how to get around there. But for me, I think it just represented the first time that I'd played the type of game that would later kind of become, I guess, something that I played much more often, as opposed to just playing sports simulators all the time and stuff like that. And so I liked how much time I was able to spend with it. And it was back when, you had a lot more time than you did money. And so I was able to just sort of poke around at it and figure out how to do certain things and how to get across the river with the hook shot and how to reflect I'm trying to remember that boss, but one of the first bosses you fight, you have to reflect his shots with the Master Sword. And I remember kind of piecing that together and thinking that was like the coolest, and so I think for me, this was just sort of like, I think of it as sort of like one of the first big games that I played to completion. And so I guess it'll always kind of hold a little bit of a space in my heart for those reasons. But yeah, so that's my number 5, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past.
Nice, yeah. That boss, by the way, I've never really known how to pronounce his name. It's like Aghanim, something like that.
Aghanim, that's what I always said.
Yeah.
All right. Well, now I know that, or now I remember that, or I have that piece of information back in my brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, and that makes sense of like, yeah, just kind of that first moment of like a different type of game like that. I also that game is also a favorite of mine. It's a wonderful game. All right, next I am up. My first game, sticking with the Super Nintendo here, is Super Mario RPG: Legend of the Seven Stars. Came out in 1996. Developed by Square, it was a collaboration between Nintendo and Square. And I picked this game because there's a lot of games from this era, the 90s, that I could have picked. I've so many games kind of representing this era of my life. And this one felt like the right one to represent this because through most of the 90s, I was primarily a Nintendo kid, but I also played a lot of Square RPGs on the PlayStation 1. And like when I think about that period in my life, like it really was like Mario, Nintendo platformers, and also RPGs. And like Mario RPG being that collaboration of those two those two types of games that I was just super into during that period. Like it just felt like the right representation of like that era of my life. And it's also just like a really fun, charming game. I also think it was the first RPG I ever played. So Nate on this podcast is my brother, so I don't know if he can back me up on this, but yeah, I think it was the first RPG we played.
Yeah,
And
I think that's right, and I definitely considered putting this on my list of 5 games as well, because yeah, it kind of opened a whole new world.
yeah. And I remember, I don't know if you remember this, Nate, you're a couple years younger than me, but I remember renting Mario RPG because we rented a lot of games back then, and loading up a save game that was on the cartridge that someone else had played and having absolutely no idea where to go because I was used to games like, I was used to like platformers and stuff of the day, right? Like games that were just like pretty straightforward, like, oh, load up the new level. So like, I remember going to where this person was on the world map and like going into the world map and like, what am I doing here? This is a town. What am I doing in this town? And it's like, oh, it's an RPG. You have to like talk to the right person to advance the plot. But I didn't know. I didn't know what I was doing. So it was just like a whole different type of game that we had to learn. Yeah, and it was. I mean, the game itself is super fun. I even think some of its ideas like haven't even gotten used that much. Like just kind of like the action time button presses and RPG combat. Like the Paper Mario games and some other things have done it, but I there's just so many clever touches in there, and you get the nice mix of Mario, like referencing Mario characters, and you get Bowser in your party, which was super novel at the time. And you get all the Square touches as well, like Malo and Gino in that game really feel like they could be Final Fantasy characters in a different game. And you kind of get all the Square touches, and this was right in the middle of Square's heyday of, when they were kind of at their peak. So it really is just like a great encapsulation of like that period of my childhood, like just the types of games I was into, and also being my first RPG, which is kind of went on to become like basically, one of my favorite genres. So like, I think that game is just really representative of like my childhood gaming era, so to speak.
Yep, for sure. And I remember, not to steal your segment here, but I remember the really dumb little things in that game that we got like super invested in. I don't know if we both did this, but I definitely remember the like ritzy hotel in that game where you can rack up a huge bill, and we would just like stay there for like a million nights to see how big we could get the bill to rack up. It's like that game is so goofy and silly, and it, like full of little interactions that we got really into because we hadn't seen a game with that kind of like built out world and character and that level of interactability like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it felt magical that it was like also a Mario game, if that makes sense, like for that period. Yeah, it was a really special game, and just had so many fun little touches and just like tons of personality, and just a really fun game as well. Yeah, like that game left a huge impression on me. And kind of timely we're doing this right now because the Mario RPG remake comes out literally next month. All right. So that was my first game, Super Mario RPG. And next up, Paul, what is your first game?
So, Mario RPG was pretty close on my list. I remember thinking it was so cool that Mario had a house, and you could just go to sleep there, and that was fantastic, And I don't even know why I thought that was so cool, but, like 10-year-old me was very excited about the fact that Mario had a place to live. So anyway, another Mario for me is actually going to take the number 1 spot, or number 5, how we're counting this. Mario 2, the US release, not Mario the Lost Levels, but the Doki Doki Panic, sort of skin, the Mario skin at Doki Doki Panic. So I put this on the list because that was the first game that I ever actually beat, period. And I was 7 or 8. I don't remember exactly when. I was fairly young, but before then, video games were kind of a thing that only like my older cousins could ever actually finish. And granted, in the NES and early SNES era, a lot of these games, they weren't really meant to be beaten. Like you're supposed to play them for a very long time. But like Flex was talking about, like we were pretty big in video game rentals when I was a kid. I didn't buy a lot of games, but I did rent a lot of them. And over the course of the one night rental period or whatever it was, I actually sat down and left the console on. Well, I think it was overnight, and I started Mario 2 and I beat Mario 2. And once I beat Mario 2, I realized that, like, man, I can beat video games too. Like, this is a thing that I am good enough at to where I can actually play them. Because before then, they were just sort of like a curiosity, So I think that without giving Mario 2 sort of too much credit for being, sort of like a revolutionary experience, it was kind of the thing that kind of let me know that, like, hey, like, yeah, video games are hard, but you can play them and you can beat them too, And that was really when I had started to get the muscle memory and also just sort of like the coordination that you don't have as a small child. I started to cross that threshold between being a small child that didn't have enough coordination to beat a thing to really being able to do that. And Mario 2 just happened to be the game that I was playing at the time. So for me, I got to put Mario 2 on the list because that really was one of those, like, like run into the kitchen and like tell your parents that you beat a video game and like you've never done that before. So a lot of fond memories around that one. So I think that's really what really drew it to this list. But yeah, Mario 2, the US version, that Toad King, man, I hit him with so many turnips and I was so happy about it. So anyway, that was really my big one that I wanted to bring up first. But yeah, that was pretty much it.
I mean, it's not every day that someone can shoot an egg at you. You can jump on that egg, ride it around, then grab it, and then throw it back at what shot it at you.
It was fantastic.
I mean, that's some pretty sweet ass gameplay.
Sure that's just how physics works.
Yeah, and like,
right.
like that Toad King was like playing his organ, and then vegetables were popping out, and I don't even know how that works, but it just did. It was just fantastic. So yeah.
I don't think I processed how weird that game was until you like spell it out in quite that way.
And Mario 2 also gave us, I believe, Birdo, Shy Guys, and Fanto. Was that the one Fanto is from?
Yes, that was the mask. That actually gave me some nightmares when I was a child, but I persevered through them, and I saw that game to completion. So,
So many gifts to the world did Mario 2 give.
Growth through hardship.
Yes. No, that's really great, Paul. Thanks for sharing. So that was Paul's first game was Mario 2, and next up, Nate, what is the first game you want to talk about?
Well, I started trying to think of what my 5 games would be, thinking I'm going to avoid all of my favorites, and I'm going to find other games that have more meaningful things to talk about. And my first game is Final Fantasy VII, which is absolutely one of my favorite games of all time because I couldn't leave it off this list.
If I was going to guess, we largely did not share a list ahead of time, but if I was going to guess one game for one person that was going to be on their list, it was going to be Final Fantasy VII for Nate.
Yep, that's just who I am. I have a lot of memories of Final Fantasy VII. I guess I'll start with, I think the memory that I come back to a lot when I think about playing Final Fantasy VII originally is I have a memory of us playing we played most of it at our dad's house because that's where the PlayStation was, and for some reason we had the PlayStation at our mom's house during the summer, and we were playing Final Fantasy VII, and the air conditioning was out for part of this time period.
I was wondering how specific you were going to get with this, but I have this exact same memory. For whatever reason, it was the middle of the summer. Our AC broke for a week.
Yeah, our AC was broken for like a week. We were home for the summer with our PlayStation, playing Final Fantasy VII all day because that's what we did during the summers, is play games all day long. the doors like open to that house to keep airflow somewhat moving in the summer without the heat. And
we moved to the basement because it's cooler in the basement.
Yes.
Normally we played in our room, but not this week.
And we finished Final Fantasy VII, and I believe, if I remember right, that was the first time we finished it.
Yes.
And I don't remember if we were like playing a save together or we were trading back and forth and just one of us finished. I don't remember the details, but I just have that specific memory of us playing on that big chunky big screen TV, CRT TV, in this hot basement with the doors open, and the like post-credit scene of Final Fantasy VII is like the stars flying when all the credits have gone, and we just like left it on for like, I don't know, half an hour or an hour because we were just like basking in the fact that we beat this game and it was so hot, and we were just like, okay, let's just let this run, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I thought eventually it would transition to another screen, so we were just like, and also that game's just such a ride that it's like you're sitting there staring at your screen. It's like, okay, what do we do now?
Right. And then since then, I've probably played this game 2-3 dozen times, and it has also stuck with me just because of its style of narrative and the complexity of the narrative, which, you know, may or may not lean into like total bullshit realms of narrative sometimes, but like it's one of those games that, sorry, say that again.
Oh, it does.
Yes, it does. But it's one of those games that like every time I played it, I felt like I was getting something new out of it from a narrative perspective, which was like very novel and interesting to me, that I could keep replaying a set in stone story that I was not changing, but still getting new things out of it just because there's so much there to chew on, and it's complex enough and long enough that was very compelling to me. And so I kept playing it, replaying it, using cheat codes and messing with all the different systems that I had available.
We had a Game Shark. Is that what it was called?
Yeah, I think Game Shark.
Yeah, we had a Game Shark.
And, you know, so it's just long been one of my absolute favorites, really shaped a lot about how I think about like video game stories and complexity and narrative. And yeah, for all those reasons, it is here on this list, and that's where it belongs.
Yeah, I'll not to add too much more time, but yeah, I mean Nate and I played this game a lot together, and I think we were trading off playing and eventually just kind of coalesced to one file that we played together for that first run. But we both played it a lot since then. But yeah, I think it was just such a wild. That game is wild, and I think it was probably one of the first games of just that narrative scope that we had both played. But yeah, that one's a good memory for me as well. A game that in some ways has never quite left us. We're
the remakes are still happening. I am anxiously awaiting Final Fantasy VII Rebirth.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that was Nate's first game. Was Final Fantasy VII. Came out in 1997 for the PlayStation 1. And moving on to Garrison's first game. What do you have for us today, Garrison?
So I literally changed my first game about 4 minutes before we started recording. So my whole list could change by the time we get to me again. So I thought pretty long and hard about like what kind of through line I wanted to kind of tell with my 5 games. And ultimately I kind of picked 5 games that to me are somewhat embodiments of my relationships with people or things. And so my first pick is kind of a pick against that because it's not a pick about relationships. But my first game is Kirby's Dream Land 2 for the Game Boy. So I am the youngest child. I have 2 older siblings. And so my family has had like video game consoles probably since before I was born. My sister was able to get an NES back when she was a kid. We had an SNES. So I've been gaming for a very long time. And so my first experiences were games like Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario World, Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego. But Kirby's Dream Land 2 is one of the first games that like I kind of picked up on my own and I got really into on my own. So it wasn't a game that I had played because my siblings had already gotten it and we had it because of them, but it was a game that, whatever reason, I picked up. I want to say like I got it before we went on some like long car road trip. That may be a false memory, I don't know. But I just completely fell in love with this game. And to this day, like, I think there are very few games that I have like played as hard as that game, to the point where I maxed out my score in Kirby's Dream Land 2. And every time I would like kill a new enemy, I'd get a 1-up because I maxed out the score, which is a level of beating a game that I don't think I've really done since then. And so, I mean, I've always been a big Kirby fan, and there are definitely Kirby games that I enjoy more. But I think Kirby's Dream Land 2 kind of holds a special place in my heart for being a game that, like, I didn't play because my siblings already had it, or I would kind of watch them play, but a game that I kind of picked up on my own and just really grew into and fell in love with. And kind of set off, I think, a love for platformers and kind of weird, charming, quirky games, and also games that Masahiro Sakurai developed.
Nice. And you became a lifelong Sakurai fan. Was that a Game Boy game?
Yes, original Game Boy.
Nice. So were you able to, like, you said there's like a lot of games in your house. Did being on the Game Boy help you like be able to find space for you to play that while other people were playing consoles or on the TV or whatever else? Did that make it like easier to play something on your own, or I'm just curious?
Very good question. I imagine so. And I think, it wasn't much longer after that my sister kind of stopped playing games. Even my brother didn't play games as much. But I still think, like, when it's a family of 5, there's only so many TVs to go around, so much TV space. So having a portable console does give you definitely more time to play things. And a Game Boy's batteries will just last forever, which is also great because you can just play and play and play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's cool. Thank you. All right, that's everyone's first game in the books. On to round 2. Will, what is your second game you have for us?
All right, so we're skipping about 8 years into the future, and it's a game called Diablo 2 by Blizzard Entertainment. That's going to be my number 4, I guess you'd call it, or number 2, as however we're going to do it. And
I think we might have at least one other person, maybe 2.
Yeah, so Diablo 2, very influential. But I guess for me, some of the things that I guess when I think about how it kind of connects with my life. So my dad was one of these folks who, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were all these like court cases and there were all these lawyers who were going on TV saying that like violent video games were like causing kids to, perpetrate school shootings and stuff like that. And my folks, sort of, I don't know, they bought into that a little bit, I think. They saw games as this very, very negative force. And also, I think, a piece of that was just the nature of Diablo 2 is, when you were trying to, get certain uniques in the game, you would end up kind of doing like runs. You might go kill a boss over and over again, hoping that he drops you a certain item. And so I think my parents saw how much the game engaged me, and that was sort of like, uh-oh, he's fallen victim, he's he's gone down the rabbit hole, and so there were all kinds of crazy things about it. Like, my dad one time took my game CDs and like hid them in his closet, and they gave them back to me like when I started graduate school or something. I mean, they were like, we just found these. And it didn't really matter because, like, since I'd already installed the game, I could just use a burned copy of it and play it. But yeah, they had my original Diablo 2 CDs like in their closet for like a decade, and so it was sort of the start of a weird relationship with video games that I had for many, many years where, I would enjoy playing games, and a lot of my closest friends were big game players, but I felt all this sort of guilt about it, that I'd sort of internalized. And so that was kind of problematic, but it was also one of the first games that introduced a lot of interesting systems. The trading I always thought was such an interesting thing. So, I would take the loot that I got from doing all my little boss runs, and I remember I would take it to these people who would have items that I wanted. Sometimes I'd give them a whole trade screen full of garbage to get one item that I wanted. I'm like, hey, why don't you take my whole inventory and give me that one item? And there were websites that you could go to online where you could set up the trades. People would post like, this is something I'm interested in trading away, and you could message them on the website and say, hey, what are you looking for? That sort of thing. I think it was also one of the first times that I played a game where I really started getting into what had become, or what ended up becoming a very William thing, which is sort of creating a build, and trying to do something unique. I mean, I had a lot of the builds that were popular, like a Frozen Orb Firewall Sorceress, and, that sort of stuff. But I also tried to do my own sort of thing. I tried to make an Inferno sorceress, and Inferno is this sort of like fire breathing thing. And when you had maxed it out, it dealt absolute bullshit damage, but it went all the way across the screen, which was kind of exciting. But that was kind of a failure. And I remember making like a Vengeance Conviction Paladin. And so all these ideas that to me were like, well, let me just try and come up with something on my own, and let me see what it ends up looking like and how it ends up doing, rather than, well, this is what we know is good, so let me just do the thing that I already know is good. But Diablo 2 was just very influential. I also played it with a lot of my friends, and so it became a very social thing. But anyway, I know we're getting low on time, so that's my 4 game is Diablo 2.
Yeah, that was actually my number 3. So like whenever Will saw me playing with people, me and Will played a lot. He talks about his builds. A lot of them were fantastic, but then he had an idea for this one sorceress that was going to max out in like the thunderstorm or whatever it was. And I'm like, Will, I'm not running around the screen while your thunderbolt kills one guy at a time. So like it was a lot of fun, and I think
you got to learn the hard way sometimes.
Sometimes, but like I think the thing for me that I really wanted to kind of hone in on when I picked this game was the social aspect. Like this was one of the first games where like we didn't have voice chat like we did now. Like I would literally pick up the phone next to the computer and I would dial Will's house phone number, and then we would be on the phone like while we played this game. And even though that was like a thing that's very 90s or early 2000s, I mean it really was one of those like that was the first sort of social experience where I'm playing a game and I'm talking to someone while we're playing it. And we had a couple of other friends that played with us. We did some boss runs. The entire concept of like the loot levels, from normal to rare, or normal, magical, rare, unique, like loot levels, and being very excited whenever that loot would drop. Like that was the kind of stuff that this game introduced me to those things, and it became a concept that we saw a lot across different games, different types. But that's the thing that kind of got me to put it on my list was the social aspect, and then just sort of that sort of gambling type mechanism of the loot drops. I did a lot of Mephisto runs, and I didn't quite understand Magic Find Gear until Will explained it to me, which also began a long tradition of Will explaining things to me that I couldn't understand in video games. but yeah, like that game introduced a whole lot of really cool stuff, especially at the time, and a lot of those concepts really have bled into what makes me choose what video games to play today. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it a lot. But that was one of mine. So I know we were talking about maybe kind of jumping in whenever someone had one of your games on their list, and that was a game I had on my list that Will had on his too. So a lot of fun stuff.
Diablo 2, good game.
Yeah, and I know Nate, this is also a big game for Nate, and I played it as well. And yeah, I think this is definitely one of those games that I feel like really represents that era for a lot of people our age, like getting on the internet, playing with friends. Like, that was kind of the era that we were of an age to first start doing that. Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for those Diablo 2, both on Will and Paul's list. So then my second game is The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Throwing you a curveball there. Yeah, so Garrison kind of said he picked a theme for his. I also did for mine, which is different. What I envision is like different periods of my life in a game that kind of represents that period. So my first game, Mario RPG, was kind of what I think of as like the my early-ish childhood period, like, you know, from when I first started playing games to like up until like maybe teenage years or whatever. And Wind Waker kind of Wind Waker came out when I was in high school, and I think there are a lot of games I could have picked for this period, but Wind Waker, I think, is one I have really strong memories of, just like being at home, as was mentioned before, like when you're a teenager, when you're that age, you just chill and play video games all day. And I remember just like sailing around the Great Sea in Wind Waker. I remember being home from spring break, like home during spring break. You get like, you know, basically a week off during high school when that game came out, because I think it came out in the spring as well. And just like chilling at home, chilling in my bedroom, which I had spent who knows how many hours playing video games over the years, and I'm just like playing this like sunny game all day, and like look outside and it's like really sunny. I'm like, oh man, this is great. And it's like it's a stark memory I have of like, you know, I feel like that like high school period, like right before you go off to college, that's right before you start getting like bigger life responsibilities. You have to like actually like be on top of things a little more. And I definitely remember like as a teenager just playing, just being a monster of just like playing games all day without a care in the world. And like Wind Waker is kind of like, for me, like in my last, it was probably in my junior year, I don't remember, 11th grade, like kind of being a couple years into high school, and like that's one of like the last memories I have of like pre-college, being an adult, so to speak, of like just really just kind of basking in like, oh, this game's great. I'm like, just really puts a smile on my face, kind of kind of like that childlike, like worry-free lifestyle, so to speak. And that's a game, for whatever reason, I really strongly associate with that era. And I mean, it's also a game I liked a lot as well. I mean, I like a lot of Zelda games, and I like Wind Waker a lot as well. And I think it's aesthetic stuff too, like the way it looks and its soundtrack, like really, like that game kind of stands the test of time, I think, in a way that some other games from like the earlier 3D era maybe don't always hold up quite as well. Maybe that's part of the reason I have like such a strong memory of that game from that era. But yeah, I just remember, or whenever I think back to that game, like I have those memories that I associate with that period of my life and the way I played that game. And I also don't think I've revisited that game since then. So maybe that's another reason that it very much feels of a time, even though I think its art style makes it timeless, if that makes sense. But it still feels of that era of my life to me. All right. So that was my second game, The Wind Waker, which I didn't say, that came out in 2003. So we'll go on to Paul, your second game.
Yeah, so for this one, I had to think about it a little bit, but I went with Asteron's Call. Asteron's Call was released in late 1999, and it was one of the first MMORPGs. It's kind of that same generation as the original EverQuest. EverQuest came out in like March of 99. Asteron's Call came out in November. And that was the first game that I played that really ignited what became a love of just MMORPGs for me. As Flex can attest to, we had a mutual friend that liked MMOs a lot more than me, but I was probably number 2, at least in the little college group there. But Asteron's Call was just one of those where it sort of introduced me to the concept. And also, like, I've actually gone back to play it recently. The game shut down in 2017, but there's still private servers. You can download the client, and you can patch it. You can log on to private servers. The amount of freedom that game gave you was pretty wild. You leveled up individual stats with XP that you earned. You leveled up individual skills. You could have any build. You could have hundreds of hours sunken into a character that ended up being complete garbage because you didn't know what the skills did, and you picked all the wrong ones to level up. Like, the game really did not give you a whole lot to go on. There was a spell system in there that was very unique, that was unique to your character. You had to use different combinations of reagents to learn spells. That's if you had the skill to even cast it. So there was a lot of stuff in that game that was obtuse. It was a very early 2000s type game, but I really enjoyed the time that I spent with it. That concept of running around with hundreds of people on the same sort of server, the same world, like that had never happened before. I got that game right around the same time that broadband internet became available to the city where I grew up, or city's the wrong word, the spot in the middle of nowhere where I grew up. And, having all of those folks on the screen, they're all real people, and they're all right there. That was one of those, that had never happened before. So it really was one of those, sort of I don't want to use the word life-changing, but it was more like wow, video games went from being me playing a video game with a controller on my CRT, sort of TV, to playing with some friends, either on couch co-op or like I was talking about earlier with Diablo 2, like me and Will on the phone, to there are people on the internet and they're on my computer monitor. And that is insane that we're all kind of doing this thing together. And that was also the first game where you had monthly patches. Like, the game content changed. Like, there were new events every single month. Some events were bigger than others, of course, but that was a live service game, which 24 years ago was something that you just did not see. I mean, this game was coming out right around the time that I think the Nintendo 64, PS1 were the predominant consoles. I can't remember when the original Xbox came out, but it's somewhere around the same time. So, but it was just wild to me that here's a video game that changes, with a bunch of people on it, with a bunch of special events, and the lore was also fairly interesting too. So it had a good story, at least to my 13-year-old mind. I don't know if the story still holds up, but I did go and reinstall it. opened it up. I started playing a character for just in the tutorial era, and man, like that game is still very dense to this day. And like I feel like I need a guide just for what do these skills mean, because the game doesn't tell you. What do these stats mean? The game doesn't tell you, but boy, you can make a lot of really poor decisions that make you have to re-roll a character very quickly. So there was a lot there. I really enjoyed my time with it. I think that there are better games of this genre that came out after it, but as far as like what it did on release and how it was sort of a stepping stone, I kind of compare it to Morrowind. Like, Morrowind had a huge amount of player agency to where you could break that game fairly easily. Asheron's Call had a huge amount of player agency. You could break that game fairly easily, but it was an MMO, and that was kind of wild that you could break in MMO. So anyway, that was my spiel for that one. If you have the time, it's worth at least reading the Wikipedia article. Maybe watching a YouTube video or two, because there was a lot of conversation around this one, and I think it's often overlooked in the early history of MMOs on the internet. So
it's always cool to hear about people's experiences with MMOs pre-World of Warcraft, because that's when that genre really took off. And like everyone I've ever talked to who played MMOs before World of Warcraft, they sound like the wildest, most like unhinged like games I've ever heard of.
Yeah, and usually when I hear about pre-WoW MMOs, it's usually EverQuest is the one I hear of. So it's kind of cool to hear about one of the other like early pioneers in that genre.
Yeah, this was like all brand new to me, and just hearing about this game was like just really cool. Like, not just your experience with it, but just like what were MMOs like before World of Warcraft. So thank you for sharing that, and just it was really cool.
Yeah, lots of fun.
Nice. So that was Asheron's Call, Paul's second game. I think that came out in '99, somewhere around there.
Yeah, so the original base game came out in November of 1999. It had 1, 2, maybe 3 expansions. I can't quite remember. But it was a very 1999 game, if that makes sense. It was developed in 96, 97, 98. So when it came out in 99, like, it was, it had some systems in there that definitely needed some polish. We'll just put it that way.
Nice. All right, so moving on, we have Nate. What is your second game?
My second game is probably continuing a lot in the trajectory that Final Fantasy VII set me on. And for this, I picked, you ready for this title? Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Sith Lords.
A champion of a lengthy title, if I've ever heard one.
Yeah, that's right. And I was
this game came out in 2004, and we played it on Xbox, but it also came out on PC.
Yeah. I don't know. Did it come out on PC at the same time?
It might have come out a little later. I know the first KOTOR was originally for a couple months Xbox exclusive.
Yeah,
and then
I'm not sure.
It was just a couple months, but I don't remember the details on KOTOR 2.
Yeah. If I could put both KOTORs on this list, I would, but I wasn't gonna be that extra about it. I love Star Wars. I like RPGs. At the time, I definitely played a lot of RPGs, and coming into the Sith Lords, the second game, I had had the experience of the weird mashup of Star Wars and BioWare game and D&D rule set that is what these are.
Just a quick snippet. How weird is it that it was a D&D the Star Wars game that is literally incorporating 3rd edition D&D rule set?
Yeah, it's bizarre. But I'll try to stay specific to the second game, even though I have plenty of fond memories of the first one. I think that as a sequel to what was a really strong Star Wars BioWare game, the sequel goes for a lot of things that were really cool and felt like big leaps to me at the time, and I still think are like, I have a lot of respect for what that game was trying to do, especially narratively. Just like the core cast of characters hit me in a lot of different ways, but I will say that the main reason that I fell for this game and played it a ton is because of the main character Kreia, who is with you for the whole game and ends up being, a main driver of the story, but her intentions are never really clear. She has a lot of twists and turns. And it was one of those games that I played that just couldn't stop thinking about it from a narrative standpoint, in terms of like, what does this mean? What does this character's motivation say about them? And like thinking about a game's narrative on the level of like trying to tease apart like characters' actions, what they're actually saying in the game to your character, and how do those line up or not line up, and what is the game trying to say about the character when they don't line up. I feel like this was a game that either it's just my age or the sheer number of times I played it over and over again, or maybe the quality of the writing, some combination of those three things clicked for me in my brain and made me think, oh, okay, a story is not just being told a story and accepting it as it is laid in front of you. It has, text and subtext and symbolism, and that's where those sorts of concepts started to click for me, at least in terms of storytelling and video games. I played as I said, I played this game through a bunch of times. I even played through one whole time with the sole purpose of, every companion character in this game, like BioWare likes to do, has a like favorability scale of how much they like you, essentially. Played through the entire game one time with the sole purpose of trying to see if I could figure out how to make, like, what would Kreia approve of, because she was such a like
she's just a pure contrarian.
She's like, anything you do, she's gonna like criticize you for. So I was like, I'm gonna try to play through this whole game doing everything exactly the way that she will approve of, and just to see if I could figure it out, because I want to understand her motivations. And you can't really do that because she is just a contrarian, and that is part of her character. But I thought it was a really fun exercise to try to engage with the game on that level. I also really randomly in high school met somebody else who really liked this game and had played it a bunch of times. And I don't know how this started, but me and this guy got into a like basically a back and forth speed run contest to see who could speed run the game the fastest. And we would share, like show each other our save files at the end of the game, and we got it down to like just like a couple of hours by like spamming through everything, using force speed powers high level to just like run through the game, whatever, like however you could power up that just AoE lightning to just run through. Speed running the game is definitely easier being dark-sided, if you couldn't guess that, because you basically
I think that's a commentary on life in general.
You just end every conversation as quickly as possible by threatening to kill somebody and then shooting them with lightning, and then force speed it running through the rest of the level. But yeah, I have a lot of memories and things wrapped up in this game. It's definitely also one of my favorites. Sort of notoriously rushed and buggy and unfinished, but it never really stopped me from trying to squeeze every last little bit out of it.
Yeah, that was always. Go ahead,
ask a quick follow-up question, Nathan?
Yeah.
So I know that you are also just a big tabletop gaming fan in general. was KOTOR your introduction to like the D&D system, or did it spur your interest in D&D, or are those interests somewhat independent of one another?
I think they were somewhat independent. I do think when I played the first KOTOR, I didn't know what D&D rules were or anything at that point. I'm pretty sure I actually played most of the first KOTOR, my first save file, through that, not understanding anything about the game because it's pretty mechanically complex, and if you don't understand any D&D, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. And I think I literally ended my first save file in the first KOTOR like wearing regular armor, which you shouldn't do in that game because you're a Jedi and you should be wearing robes because that's how you get like all of your good bonuses. But I just didn't understand it mechanically. I think I got more into actual tabletop games and stuff probably a little bit later. I don't remember the exact timeline on that, but I don't think they were like totally in lockstep.
Yeah, it was for me. I first played D&D around the time that KOTOR 1 came out, and you're a couple years younger than me, and it was probably a couple years before I remember us playing D&D together. So yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, those are both KOTOR games, fantastic games that I also have a lot of fond memories of. But yeah, that was KOTOR 2, Nate's second game. And moving on to Garrison, what is your second game?
So my second game, also something of a random inclusion. Yesterday at work, I just needed like just some ambiance music, so I found some random YouTube playlist of like relaxing video game music. And the very first song on that list was the theme song to the town of Mac Anu from the .hack games. I don't know if anyone is even familiar with .hack. It kind of had a moment in the mid-2000s and then kind of disappeared. But, you know, I mentioned my first game that I was going to talk kind of in the context of relationships. So it will come, it probably is no surprise to my co-host here, that I am an awkward person. Sometimes, like, forming friendships is challenging for me. But I experienced the .hack games about the time when my family moved from Virginia, where I did have some friends, to North Carolina, where I knew no one. And so that was a very challenging time for me for reasons that I go into with my therapist. But ultimately, .hack was important to me for a couple of reasons. One is that it was one of my gateways into RPGs. I had dabbled in RPGs before. I had played like Final Fantasy VII, but hadn't really engaged with them as a genre. I would say there were games besides .hack that really kind of got me into the genre, but it was still one of my gateways into RPGs, that form of storytelling. But I also think .hack was emblematic of like what my social circle was at that time. So .hack is a game all about a fake video game, a fake MMO. And so you are running around with your fake friends, but there's also an entire like fake virtual internet, fake virtual message board that you interact with as you are putting together all the pieces of this kind of larger mystery. And so the internet is really where I kind of spent a lot of time in my teenage years. That was where a lot of my friends were. It's where I made a lot of connections, especially as my family moved. The internet was kind of the place where I had some kind of, was able to have regular contact with online friends, but also the friends I left behind. And so I think I got super into this franchise, like all the lore, all the spin-offs, all everything. But when I think about it, I really think about just the ways that like it kind of helped me feel a little bit at home in a time when I was very adrift. They are kind of garbage games. Like, I would not recommend playing them. And I say games, like I know we're picking like one game, but .hack is like 4 games that are basically one game. Like, they sold for $200 what could have been a $50 single game. Again, don't play them. But the story and the lore and that experience were very cool and also very comforting to me at a time when I was going through a lot, and kind of gave me some fake friends to accompany my real friends, but also emblematic of the ways the internet can provide community and spaces in ways that can be healthy. For all the ways that the internet can be terrible, it can also be a very positive and healthy force as well.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And yeah, I feel like especially those of us that were, you know, in our teenage years during those like early internet time, like I think it did have an effect on us. One, you know, the internet can be terrible, but as you said, it can also provide a lot of those kind of like outlets for us as well. So yeah, no, that's cool. I have never played those games, but it was cool listening to your experience with them.
Don't, but read the Wikipedia article, because the plot is actually really fun. Even like still holds up even now that like the way the internet's changed ever since. It still feels like a good, like, relevant story.
Nice. All right, so that was, we'll just say .hack, not a specific one. It was Garrison's second game. And moving on to round 3, Will, what would you like to share with the class today for your third game?
I'll share with the class a game called Magic the Gathering Online that came out originally in 2002, developed by Leaping Lizard Software and Wizards of the Coast, which I did not know. Leaping Lizard Software was a thing. But Magic sort of continued that sort of trend that I guess I started in Diablo 2 of like trying to create my own thing, you know, trying to sort of create something that was uniquely mine. And with Magic, it was sort of taken to the nth power because, you know, you've got these 60 card decks that you're customizing. Usually 20 of them are lands, but the other 40 are whatever you want. And ChatGPT told me that when I started playing in 2003, there were about 7,000 cards that were already kind of released. And of course, there's a lot more now, but I stopped playing a number of years ago. But it was something that I spent an awful lot of time playing, that and Guild Wars when I was in college. And so I think it was just a really great way for me to kind of be creative and express creativity. I think I had something like 10 decks that were physical, and then online I had something like 30, because essentially you could have one set of 4 cards and put them in every single deck, whereas if you were trying to do that playing physical Magic, you would have to move the cards back and forth between different decks and things like that. So also, you know, in college was really when I first started dealing with anxiety. And one of the things that I used to do as almost a coping skill is I would just like design Magic decks. And so, and a lot of them I didn't even intend to build. It would just be, you know, I'd find a card and I would say, well, this is kind of interesting. Let me see what it would look like to try and build a deck off of that, you know. And so I would just see what I could find, see what I could come up with. But yeah, so that would be my third game is Magic the Gathering Online. It's sort of a little bit of a cheat because I guess I played a lot of the physical as well as the online version, but I think it's definitely representative of me and my gaming taste and my gaming history.
Yeah,
I'd also like to note, I said earlier that Diablo 2 began when Will just told me how to do things. Every Magic deck I ever had, I didn't build it. Will did. I've still got like 3 Magic decks left physical, and my most cherished possession is the Scornful Egotist that Will built for me. So thank you very much.
You still have it.
I still got, dude, it's still not in sleeves. You told me never to sleeve it. It wasn't.
You know, it's not worth it. It's not worth it.
Yeah, fantastic.
For the audio listeners, Paul just held up a deck of Magic cards, the front card being said scornful egotist. Yeah, so I met Will around this time, and yeah, we played a lot of actual like physical Magic the Gathering, and Paul played as well. And I think this is a totally valid inclusion. I wouldn't even disparage if you wanted to just say Magic the Gathering, not even in video game form. But yeah, no, that was definitely a big part of. Like I definitely see that one in you. I also remember, I don't know if you remember this. I remember you saying to me one time that you like getting into things so deep that you like start building an encyclopedia of stuff in your brain. And I remember you saying that both Diablo 2 and Magic were things that you did that for, and those are two games you've talked about here.
Yeah, that's probably fair. I definitely had, and I think that helps you so much when you're building a deck, and is that you just have a lot of good utility cards, and you're thinking like, what are going to be the specific weaknesses of this thing? Well, how can I cover for those weaknesses? And you've got like a kind of a bank in your mind of like, okay, so this is where I should go with this or something like that. So yeah, I definitely, now my encyclopedia at this point is probably like one of those old like world books from like 1995. Like it's so out of date, you know what I mean? but yeah, it was at one point it was pretty good.
I mean, in your encyclopedia, Dark Steel Colossus is still like the champ, the big boy.
Forever.
I'm sure there are like bigger, tougher things now. Anyway, old Magic jokes aside. Yeah, so that was Will's second game, Magic the Gathering Online.
I think that was my third. I think that was my third, yeah.
I can count. That was Will's third game. And my third game, sorry, clearing the throat here. So for me, I was trying to think of what I kind of covered like childhood and teenage years. So like what was the next era I wanted to focus on? And that was kind of like my college years. I kind of settled on that period because I mean, college feels like an era unto itself. A lot of things. College is a weird time, let's say. And again, as with all of these, there's a lot of different games I could have chosen. But the game I settled on to represent this period of my life is a game called Elite Beat Agents, which is a Nintendo game came out in 2006 on the Nintendo DS, and it is an incredibly silly game and also legit one of my favorite games ever. And it felt like a good representation of this period of my life because for a couple reasons. One, just coincidentally, it was also like a big period for rhythm games and like kind of the first period I got into rhythm games. Like DDR had been around since well before then, of course, but like this was when I was in college was the first time I played DDR and got into it. It was also around the same time that like Guitar Hero and Rock Band and all of those things were blowing up. So like rhythm games were huge in this period. And Elite Beat Agents was definitely like the one that grabbed me the most. And I found out that I do really like rhythm games. I did play a lot of DDR and Guitar Hero and Rock Band and all that stuff, but Elite Beat Agents was the one that really grabbed me. The other thing that I think this is really emblematic of this time period is like physically I was doing a lot of like moving around in this period because like at its core there's just the basic like traveling back and forth between home and college. Like you go home for breaks and then you're in college and you're constantly changing dorms and all of that stuff. So I remember not always having access to consoles necessarily, and also Nate and I would kind of share consoles. We didn't we didn't both have a PlayStation 2 or an Xbox 360. So like at any given time we were kind of splitting them up. But for whatever reason, I don't remember if we both had DSs or what, but for some reason I remember always having like my GBA and my DS with me. Like those were just kind of staples.
Yeah, I think you got a DS and I didn't get one for myself until later. But I think that was like something that you specifically got.
Yeah, because I definitely just remember always having my DS with me.
Your big brick DS.
Yes, I got it. I did eventually get a light, but I had the brick for a number of years, and the time period when I played Elite Beat Agents was the brick. But also I studied abroad. I did like a summer research program one summer, which was at a different school. And like all of these travels, I would bring my DS with me. So like I got a lot of play on the DS, and there were a lot of good games on the DS, and I did consider some other games for this spot, but like when it came down to it, like Elite Beat Agents is my favorite DS game. It's my favorite rhythm game to date. Like I got absolutely obsessed with this really dumb game that is also like really just well made. Like it's very silly in its aesthetic and style and premise and all of that stuff. But I also think it's a legit great rhythm game. It's one of the few games I've ever played where I just like played it so much that I absolutely mastered it. Like compared to other rhythm games, it didn't have quite as many songs as like a Guitar Hero or DDR or whatever. But I like when I say I mastered this game, I literally mean like I played every song until I perfected them. And I don't mean just like hit every note. I mean, because like when you hit notes in a rhythm game, it could be like, oh, good, great, perfect, whatever. I mean, literally played through the entire song, hitting every note perfect. So I played those songs a lot. There was one year where Paul and I were roommates, and I'm pretty sure he got tired of hearing the songs from Elite Beat Agents because I played them so many times.
Yeah, I was definitely going to touch on that. Flex is not exaggerating here. I heard the opening like 9 beats to "I Was Born in a Crossfire Hurricane" at least 100 times. I don't actually know what of those first 9 beats was such a complex movement, but boy, did I hear that song restart a lot, and those first 9 beats again.
Yeah. And to fit in with the theme of moving around, like I have memories of playing Elite Beat Agents in the dorm. I remember playing it at home. I remember playing it when I did like a research program one summer. I also got super into the Unden games, played both of those. Like I went down a rabbit hole with this game, and I just have really strong memories of the DS specifically, like just like being a companion with me as I was doing like all of this moving around during that time period, just constantly traveling back and forth, studying abroad, different dorms, home, school, whatever. So it is a really strong memory from that period of my life, and just an absolutely nutty yet fantastic game. Like that game, that I will take that game with me to the grave. That game is a just wonderful little mess of a game.
Pretty good.
All right, so that was my third game, Elite Beat Agents, and Paul's third game we've already talked about. That was Diablo 2. So we're gonna skip over Paul here and go to Nate. What is your third game you would like to talk about?
Well, continuing in the tradition from narrative-focused games with Final Fantasy VII and KOTOR 2, my third game is Guitar Hero.
Yeah, that definitely follows along. Yeah, that makes sense.
Nice.
Definitely continuing off of Elite Beat Agents there. So we are in the area of rhythm game innovation and widespread popularity for sure. So Guitar Hero is, I don't know if I can quite say it's one of my like absolute favorite games of all time, but it's definitely one that like hit me really hard when I first got into it. Like I think it did a lot of people. That very first game I tried to pick up and figure out how to play, and I definitely have memories of just like seeing the notes scrolling down the highway and holding the big clunky clicky guitar controller and trying to figure out how to make my hands do the right movements. And that was like a cool learning process because at that point we were also used to just kind of standard shaped controllers and game interfaces, and so it was definitely just a new experience that hit me very hard in terms of like, oh, this is something like that I can just sit and practice with and play with and get really good at, which I have a like kind of weird relationship with Guitar Hero and like it being like becoming like sort of like a performative thing. Like I feel like I got to a point where I had played it so much that I could play it very proficiently at the high difficulties on the harder songs, and then would get like extreme performance anxiety playing around people because I felt like I was like um showing either showing off or like, oh, you think you're good at this game, but you're not, like weird imposter syndrome mixed with performance anxiety mixed with feeling like I'm being like a show-offy jerk. So I I kind of went back and forth with that a lot throughout my time playing these games and things like Rock Band. And I specifically never got super into Rock Band because I didn't like want the stress of having to learn how to do the drums correctly around groups of people and like that just stressed me out. So I was like, well, I already know how to play the guitar. I'll play that, but it's basically the same as Guitar Hero was. But yeah, for some reason that very first Guitar Hero for me, like it probably, I mean, it is just the novelty of it, almost certainly. But like that set list, I learned in and out completely. Like 5-starred every song on the highest difficulty over and over and over. Um, and it was just one of those like really, when I was just kind of in the zone playing just to try to improve my score and not worrying about the performance side of it. Like it was just like a very zen, like I could just zone into it, and it felt like I was, even though I wasn't really developing any useful skill, I was figuring out how to press the 5 colored buttons on the fretboard of the guitar in the right order. It felt like really cool for it to become like so quick and natural to do certain note combinations just from sight reading. And so it was just gratifying in that way that I hadn't had in games like that before. But yeah, that's pretty much my short spiel on Guitar Hero. That game definitely, like, in some ways a big flash in the pan because it came and went so strongly. But for those few years where I was really into it, and I wanted to be able to like perfect it and like learn how to do it the right way, and it was a cool new feeling.
Yeah, that first one, there's chatter going on in our Discord of like the best set list of games, but I do think that first one, like for being first, was super novel. And it was like, I mean, it spawned all of the Guitar Hero, Rock Band, DJ Hero, like just Rocksmith. Like there's so many games that followed after it, and I mean that first one got it, like did it well enough, and I liked the set list of the first game too.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a good set list, and I think that had like it felt really like dialed in terms of like they made the note tracks like a good scaling of difficulty up throughout the set list, and the mechanics of the game supported exactly what they wanted you to kind of like learn throughout the set list. I think some of the later Guitar Heroes kind of got off the rails with like we're just going to do a bunch of face melting solos, which by the time those came around, I liked that because I had played so much of it. But I don't think that it has the same like consideredness that first game had about like, oh, what can a person reasonably do with this controller if you hand it to them, and then like what does the game mechanics actually kind of support in a way that feels like you're playing a rhythm game and not just like smashing on the buttons.
Are you saying that playing Through the Fire and the Flames is not a good first Guitar Hero experience?
No, it's definitely not. I don't know that it's a good Guitar Hero experience ever, really, but
Did you ever beat it Through the Fire and Flames?
oh, I don't actually remember if I did or not. I'm going to say probably not, or else I would probably remember.
I remember you practicing a lot, but I don't remember if you ever beat it or not.
Yeah, I honestly can't remember, so I'm going to say I probably didn't.
There is a real performative element to it, though. I mean, it's not that it's, you can become really skilled at any game, but like if you're really skilled at Guitar Hero, your hands are doing more than they are if you're just holding a controller and doing more subtle movements. So I could see where it might be the type of thing where, people would be more interested in watching someone who is skilled at it, because, they're doing more physically,
Yeah.
than you are. It seems like you're doing more, maybe.
Yeah, I definitely felt that like people would stop and watch you playing if you're playing Guitar Hero in a dorm room or something. Like I even remember once in college in I think it was our freshman suite of dorms that we were in, like some maintenance person coming in one day and I'm playing a Guitar Hero in the living room, just just shredding away, and he just like stops and like watches me for a few minutes, and I'm like, dude, leave me alone. I'm just trying to play Guitar Hero.
Don't you have a toilet to plunge?
And I totally get the performance anxiety, but for the record, Nate played a lot of Guitar Hero and was very good at it.
I got good at it by playing a whole heck of a lot of it.
I won't believe it until I see it.
Well, I don't know that I have it anymore. It's been a long time.
All right, well, that was Nate's third game, Guitar Hero. The original one came out in 2005 for the PlayStation 2. And that brings us to Garrison. What is your third game?
So my third game is not a rhythm game, although I do deeply love Elite Beat Agent. I'm so glad to see that represented on this podcast.
Oh, yeah.
So when last we left Garrison, he was moving to a new state and adrift. So let's jump ahead a couple years to 2000. I should have checked the year. I think 2007, early 2007, when a game called Pokemon Diamond came out.
That was 2007.
So I had moved to North Carolina, and it was very challenging, and it was not great in many, many ways. And so I had talked about last time how my community was online, and that was still very much the case when Pokemon Diamond came out. And Pokemon Diamond is significant for being the first Pokemon game that featured online play. And so, as a lonely kid whose friends were mostly online, and whose friends, fortunately, happened to be all very big into Pokemon, this was a new chance for me to connect with my online community. And so, again, thinking about how games kind of helped me with relationships or kind of symbolized relationships for me, Pokemon has always been like an interest of mine, so it kind of had to be on this list somewhere. And honestly, like of the first 5 generations of Pokemon games, Diamond is probably my least favorite. But that opportunity to connect with friends through the game, to trade with friends in the game, to collaborate and communicate, that was really meaningful to me. And kind of one of the things about Pokemon Diamond is that it kind of came out after, how like amongst friends when you're teenagers, there can be just really stupid drama that like causes all sorts of like tiffs. So there had been a tiff in my friend group around the time that Pokemon Diamond came out. And this game was kind of one of the things that kind of helped us like just get over that hump. Because on one hand, you might be really mad at someone, but also they have Pokemon Pearl, and they can help you evolve your Electabuzz or something. And, what's more important? Like, the thing someone said or evolving your Electabuzz? So, in a kind of very challenging time for me, Pokemon Diamond helped me use video games to connect to friends in a new way. I have certainly played some other games with online functionalities. My friends from Virginia were big Halo people, so we played that a lot. But I really think Pokemon Diamond is what kind of crystallized like the way video games could foster a community with people kind of far away in a way that other games really hadn't for me. Also, Infernape is really cool. And all the starters in Gen 4 are really cool. So, yeah.
I also have a fondness for Gen 4, just the new Pokemon in that game, and B, Gen 4 has by far the best Pokemon soundtrack. It's fantastic. Also, I blame Nate for getting me into training competitive Pokemon in Gen 4, which is where I started going down that rabbit hole, and yeah, thanks, no thanks.
Well, and I have to blame Garrison for getting me on that train, so it comes full circle here.
So Garrison, you you influenced multiple members on this podcast with your Pokemon Gen 4 enthusiasm.
If that's my contribution, there are worse things to be infamous for.
Yeah, no, that's really great though, and I can see how that was like a formative game, and like one that stuck a lot. All right, so we've done 3 games for everyone. Moving on, Will, what is your 4th game?
4th game is one that I think maybe only you are familiar with, Flex. It's from 2009, developed by Action Forms, entitled Cryostasis Sleep of Reason. So there's a lot I kind of want to say about this, but I'll try and kind of keep it to a minimum. I think one of the things that was a big feature in my childhood was Presbyterian church. I did a lot of going to Presbyterian church and didn't really like much any of it. When I was young, I didn't behave the right way, so I got a lot of beatings, I guess, or whippings because I was crawling and doing things that I wasn't supposed to do. But I always kind of have had a fraught relationship with religion, and enter cryostasis to kind of, in a way, speak to some of the themes that have always sort of, some of the things I guess I've always thought. You grow up hearing about the Old Testament God and how he's sending plagues and floods and all kinds of stuff, and he's very, very judgmental and very, very severe. But Cryostasis is a game where you find a giant ice-breaking ship that has been frozen. And not only has the ship been frozen, but the crew has been frozen. And not only has the crew been frozen, but the crew has been frozen in such a way that their souls are trapped on the ship. And another interesting thing about cryostasis is that the temperature, how much warmth you have, is essentially doubles as your health. So when you get hit, you lose warmth, and you have to regenerate warmth at lamps and stuff, and try and kind of dash between different heat sources. But you can find these trapped crew members and activate these echoes of their soul and replay the last moments of their lives. While you're doing this, you can make different choices, because a lot of these crew members made choices that were somewhat selfish at the very end of their lives, and you probably, you could be blamed for thinking that maybe they put themselves in a very bad situation by not working together in the way that they could have when the ship began to get stuck in the ice. But you go through, activate these echoes, free as many of these guys as you can, and finally, you end up fighting Chronos, which represents God at the end of the game. He's like the god of time. And he's kind of annoyed that you've been meddling with kind of what his punishment was for these sailors. And so you fight him, and defeat him in some way, shape, or form. Obviously not permanently, but he allows you to activate the souls of the captain and basically make it as though the ship was never frozen. And at the end, you're kind of walking alongside the captain, the three captains of this icebreaker. But to me, this idea of sort of pushing back against such a cruel and judgmental force, I think it resonated with me in a very, very intense way. And I remember, it was one of these games that, as the credits were rolling, I was leaking, because I was just so, I guess, moved by, what the game accomplished and what I was able to do. But yeah, I was able to convince Flex to play it, but it was a janky Slavic game, and I think you had to really push through some jank to actually see what was there. And I certainly don't. I don't begrudge him the fact that he didn't make it through.
Yeah, I didn't make it through, but like I've definitely like I know this game has resonated with a lot of people and obviously resonated with you, and like I think that's super like I don't think a lot of games can resonate on that level with everyone. So like I don't know. I think that's really really important, like the experience you've had with it.
Yeah, but that's the number 4, I guess we'd call it.
Yeah. Sure, we'll go with that. The fourth game you've shared. Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. So I'm up next. My fourth game is a game multiple of us played as well, and so I'm moving on to my post-college time period here. So now I'm a real adult. And the game I chose for this kind of like early adulthood period is StarCraft 2. This game came out in 2010 on PC. I was a big fan of the original StarCraft, which I considered putting StarCraft 1 on this list because that had a huge impact on me. But ended up going with StarCraft 2 because post-college years, I think, is kind of a weird time where it's like, okay, now what do I do with my life? Because like up until then, I feel like you're going through school, like there's only so many choices you get to make. But when I think about like that early post-college period, like that was the period of my life where I was like playing more multiplayer games, specifically online multiplayer games, more than any other period in my life. And that's probably due to life circumstances in a way of like, okay, like we all graduate college, we all kind of scatter and go wherever, and we're not necessarily near the friends you've been with for a while. And like for my part, I moved to a different state, and like then you're in this period of like, making new friends or, learning a job and all of this stuff. And I think especially because the way of the internet and on consoles and stuff, like it was, and on PC, it was like easier than ever to like connect and play games online. So I played, like, those were my Call of Duty years. Like I played, I was also a period where I was doing like some Pokemon competitive stuff, as I mentioned before, and not competitive games, but also games just like Borderlands and like other cooperative games, like just really playing a lot of games online. But StarCraft 2, I think, is the biggest of the bunch for me during that period. And I mean, it was definitely my favorite multiplayer game of that bunch, and probably the one I played the most as well. And also, I just freaking love StarCraft. Like, both StarCraft 1 and 2 are just, like, really fantastic games, really good real-time strategy games that I got super into. And StarCraft 2 also was a big thing in my life for years. And part of that is probably because they chose to split it up into 3 different games. So there were 3 parts of it, so the first part came out in 2010, but then the second part was 2013, then the third part was 2015. So, I mean, it was like a whole 5-6 years that I was playing that game multiplayer on and off. And I was like reading patch notes, like coming up with like build orders. Like Nate and I went to a Major League Gaming event and like watched actual pro StarCraft live. Like that was a thing I was like super into and played online, like including with people here, like teaming up with 2v2s and 4v4s and whatever to have fun with. And yeah, it was just like, even though I had moved to a new state and was like working a job and like my first real job and everything, like StarCraft 2 was still a way to like connect with existing friends and was like definitely a big part of my life for a few years there.
Yeah, we definitely played a lot of StarCraft 2, Flex. You know, I started dating my now wife whenever we were playing StarCraft, so she has a lot of fond memories of let's just say us having a lot of good sound effects to go along with the game while we were playing. So that was StarCraft 2 was pretty close for me on this list. Honestly, it ended up not quite making it, but yeah, that was a really good game and a really fun time.
Yep, it was a good one. All right, so that was my fourth game, StarCraft 2. And Paul, what is your fourth game you would like to talk about?
Yeah, so I can't pick one as far as like the series, but my number 4 is actually Dance Dance Revolution is which the one that I'm going with. It a bunch of releases over the years, both arcade and we played a lot on PS2. I think we were playing like DDR Max 2 or DDR Extreme on the PS2. I don't quite remember in college, but I picked DDR because this was the first time that, as we were talking about with the Guitar Hero, like I was playing a video game and I felt real cool while I was playing the video game, right? Like, as Will can attest to, when I was a child, I was always a chubby child. And then I went to college and I started playing a lot of DDR and a lot of racquetball, and that was 17 years ago and 100 pounds ago. But DDR was one of those games where, like, whenever I sat down or stood up, shall we say, to play it, it felt like it was really one of those, like, not only am I doing something that is mentally engaging, but the physical aspect is something that a video game has never done before and hasn't done since, right? We still have DDR pads hooked up to our gaming PC in our house today. There's something about those movements, those motions, the way that it introduced me to new genres of music that I had never heard of before. Like I would never have found Captain Jack just sort of like on my own, right? And I mean, there's a lot of goofy, fun music in those games, but there was a real fondness and a lot of real fond memories, whether it was like me and Flex or whether it was just more of us than that, because like our entire college suite pretty much played DDR at one point or the other. And I think that part of my sort of like, especially my college kind of physical fitness journey, like I did a lot of running in college, but I didn't start out by running. I started out by playing DDR, and I wanted to play more, and I was out of breath after like 3 or 4 songs. So I started running. I lost some weight. It was all a really good time, but when I think of the totality of what that game kind of did, like it gave me like a lot of really cool sort of memories of camaraderie, because whenever you're playing a song on like heavy or challenge and you and the person that you're playing next to, your steps are like perfectly lining up, like that feels really cool. Like you feel almost like you're in like the Pacific Rim kind of machine and the two of you are kind of doing the steps at the same time. And there were definitely times when like just we would be getting into kind of a flow, and we like both people, like me and whoever the second person was, you'd hit the 100-step combo at the same time because you hadn't missed one from the very beginning of the song. And just sort of that dopamine hit and that rush and how good that felt, but also like the physical aspect of it, because if you to a certain amount of physical exertion, you get all kinds of happy brain chemicals. Like, that was something that, as a video game, you never had that. Like, sitting down with the stuff that you were playing beforehand. You could have some of that, right? But that whole sort of complete package of, man, this feels real good, and I feel real good, and I feel real cool. Like, DDR was the first game that really sort of packaged all of that together into a way where, like I don't know that I've ever had as high of a high from all the happy brain chemicals than, like, me and Flex playing AM3P on Challenge, and then we friggin' finish it, and neither one of us failed. And of course, he always beat me in score, because let's be honest, he's like 100 pounds like lighter than me, and my legs don't move that way. But, like, it was just so much fun, kind of going through that experience, with that second person on the dance pad. And, Steph and I still have fun, like I said, playing DDR to this day. Like, I'm now an adult and I have adult money. I have really nice pads sitting over there. And every so often I'll, boot up DDR. And unfortunately, I can't play the songs on Heavy or Challenge anymore. My legs don't quite move that fast. But that sort of, early to mid-college experience of just even people you don't know setting up DDR pads in, the bottom floor in the common area, and then just people show up to just watch DDR. The same way that, Nate, you kind of talked about with Guitar Hero. That drew a crowd, and it was a crowd of nerds, and I had never quite been in a crowd of nerds up until that point. So, just a lot of really, really positive memories around that. And I really do feel like it'll be hard pressed for another video game to come out and generate that level of camaraderie and also that level of the happy chemicals from the physical exertion. I don't know that we're going to see another one of those, which makes DDR fairly unique for me. So that's my number 4, and that's definitely, out of the 4 I've listed so far, that one has been the most sort of complete experience as far as this game makes me feel good, so yeah, that's my number 4. Curious if you guys have any other thoughts, but I really enjoyed my time with that, and especially my time in college with it.
Yeah, DDR is a super fun time. It does, the muscle memory does get ingrained too, because I haven't played much DDR for a few years, but I think I could just jump back into it very quickly because I did play a lot of it, and it's super fun, and it's a good workout too, like you said.
I still have some of those songs burned into my brain, and they will just pop into my song quite frequently. Just last week, one of them did. And I was never even that into it, but it will get into your mind and not let go for decades now.
All right, so that was Paul's 4th game was DDR. Moving on to Nate, what is the 4th game you would like to talk about?
All right, so took a little detour with Guitar Hero for my list, but I will say generally my experience with games as I grew up and started playing more and more different types of games, I still focused mainly on RPGs and single player games that had a lot of narrative, and those kind of got bigger budgets and more streamlined and better game mechanics and more accessible and widespread as gaming evolved through the 2000s. And then I played Demon's Souls, and that game throws a lot of common wisdom about video game design out the window. And I know that From Software has a rich history of games before Demon's Souls comes out. But I also know that for me, this was the game that introduced me to that studio and how they think about things. And I think for me and a lot of other people, it was like a revelation at the time for just a different way to think about a big sprawling, mechanically dense, challenging action RPG. Because like I was saying, a lot of games in that era had gotten more streamlined, more built for a wide audience. And so it stood out immediately in that landscape, and I have so many memories of banging my head against this weird, inscrutable game because it just does not explain anything. It intentionally misleads you or allows the community to intentionally mislead you. And just kind of plops you into this crazy, weird, inscrutable world and says, figure it out. It'll be a fun time, probably, eventually. So I put this on this list, not because it's my favorite Souls game, but because it is the one that I have the strongest memories of my time playing it, just because how different it felt, how new it felt, how much it made me rethink a lot of the common wisdom about games and game design that had felt like they had been cemented over the years before that. So this isn't one that I would say is like particularly like strongly tied to like personal time in my life or anything like that, but in terms of the way I think about and play games and what I look for in games, this was one of those that just completely reshifted my thinking about what games are and what I get out of them and what I want to look for in games going forward. And so it spawned off the whole subgenre of Souls likes that I continue to play and enjoy to this day. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward for me for this one, but Demon's Souls was a weird, unique one for the for the PlayStation 3. I did buy a PlayStation 3 around the same time this game came out with the money I made from my summer job in college, I think. And this was one of the first games I played on the PlayStation 3, and I was like, "Wow, this thing is bizarre and weird," and I kind of kind of fell in love with it.
I think it's hard after so many other like Souls games and Elden Ring and like all of these other games to stress for anyone who wasn't there at the time how just absolutely wild Demon's Souls was. Like, other than like games I played when I was younger, like, oh, this was my first RPG or my first strategy game, or like me getting introduced to new types of games just because of my age. Like, Demon's Souls is far and away the game I played that was just like, what in the world? Like, it was a paradigm shift, like, for sure. And that game came in with no marketing. Nobody knew anything about that game before it came out. Like, there was no it was hard to find guides or anything for a long time after it came out because it just came in so under the radar. Like that, and it like you said, it upended like a decade's worth of like where the design trends were heading in games. Yep. So it was just like one of the most left field gaming experiences I've ever had. And people don't often talk about that one, but that is by far the most memorable of From Software's games for me. Like, no contest.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say, like, when you mentioned there were no guides at the time, and combine that with how inscrutable it is, it does also make me remember like how strong of a community this game like created and built. That style of community still kind of endures with their FromSoft Souls games today, like the wikis that came out of Demon's Souls and how detailed people were, and like just like mining, because the game just doesn't tell you anything. So it was like people got so invested in like digging into the game and workshopping things and figuring out ways to like get the information out of it, and then sharing that on wikis and forums built a very strong community, and was even probably further helped by the like asynchronous social messaging system in the game that was really innovative at the time too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I mean people talked about the game for being hard, but I think the game's lasting legacy is the online stuff. Like it really led to that kind of community feel, despite being a mostly single player game. All right, so that was Demon's Souls. I also bought a PlayStation 3 to play that game, and Uncharted 2, which came out around the same time. All right, so that was Nate's fourth game, and Garrison, what is your fourth game?
Gosh, somewhere I have a great picture of Nathan right after he bought his PS3, and I cannot find it. So anyway, so to recap the story of Garrison, I like Kirby, and then I got real lonely for a while. And then I went to college, and let me tell you, as a very awkward kid who did not really have real life friends, was going to college after like not having a lot of great interaction with anyone for a while. That was really, really terrifying. But freshman year of college, a game came out called Super Smash Brothers Brawl. And Smash Brothers is what like brought my freshman dorm group together. In particular, like it is one of the games through which Nathan and I really connected and bonded. And so coming into college, I had a GameCube, which I brought with me, and we just happened to have a group of people who were super into Smash Brothers. Like genuinely, we probably played Smash Brothers every single day the first 2 years of college. And so freshman year started in 2007, and the hype train for Smash Brothers Brawl was in full swing. Every night at midnight we had Japan time. We'd get our daily update on the website, and the next day we would get real excited about like, oh my gosh, they just announced freaking Sonic the Hedgehog, or oh, they gave us the like pause screen. Thanks, Sakurai. And so like truly like that was what like gave me my community in college. Like Nathan, I don't know if you know how much that meant to me, or like how much that potentially like saved me from like what could have been if I had wound up with a different friend group. But like I like feel like I became like a fully fledged functional person in college. And there were many things that led to that, like, growing and learning and maturing as a person. But a huge part of that kind of college experience is like making friends. And those friends primarily I made because of freaking Super Smash Brothers Brawl, with all its weird mechanics, with its tripping, all this dumb stuff. But genuinely, like, I cannot thank Nathan enough for like being my friend and bonding with me through this game. Like, we've now done midnight releases for the last 3 Smash Brothers in a row, and I hope whenever the next one comes out that we will be able to like knock down family obligations and just like still stay up till midnight somehow and like play these games, because really like
we'll make it happen.
Smash Brothers like is friendship to me, and I could not do this list without including that game and without talking about how much that game like made a difference to me in terms of like giving me friends.
No, yep, you're absolutely right. Smash Bros. Brawl might be the black sheep of the franchise to a lot of people, but it holds a special place in my heart for sure. Playing it with you guys in college.
Yeah, I think like regardless of like being the black sheep or whatever the franchise, like all the Smash Bros games are good, and like I think like the time and place of it makes a huge difference, and like that being the one that like clicked with the people around you at that time and like provided that friend group like is super important. Well, not to just move on from the very heartfelt. I appreciate all the sharing. That was really great. That was Garrison's fourth game, Smash Brawl. The hard cut transition. Moving on to everyone's final game. Will, what is your fifth and final game?
My fifth and final game is 2017's What Remains of Edith Finch. And it was developed by a company called Giant Sparrow. And I think it's essentially about, I guess, this family that has been sort of beset with tragedy, and basically, in a way, I think it explores kind of how to make sense of tragedy, and there's, as I've been practicing, therapy for like a decade now, I guess, I've come to the point where I do talk a lot about meaning with my clients. I'll ask them, what did it mean to you that this happened, and, or, and of course you can process trauma as part of that can be asking people kind of, how you made sense of this thing that happened to you, but, but to me, with What Remains of Edith Finch, I mean, there's just so much tragedy and so many early deaths that have sort of beset this family, and you play through these tales that kind of tell you a little bit about their lives, and the tales are sort of like unapologetically exaggerated. They're sort of preposterous, magnified tales, and I think that's one of the reasons I guess I kind of like it is because, in the face of, having such short and sometimes brutal lives, why not create the most unique and wild meaning, and, why not exaggerate a little bit and engage in hyperbole in terms of like, your in terms of, the way you make sense of your life. There's this quote, it's like, the past is a story that you tell yourself, and I guess I felt like What Remains of Edith Finch sort of lent itself to that sort of idea in a way that really, really resonated with me. And so I guess to me now, one of the reasons I pick it as sort of my fifth is because I guess I feel like it resonates more with sort of the way I make sense of my life than any other kind of game I've played. I guess I felt like I could feel sort of what some of these characters, not necessarily what they were going through, but just sort of, I guess trying to strive to create something out of something that is so brutal and short. I guess I guess it's hard to sort of talk about without going into too much of the characters, but yeah. So my number 5 is What Remains of Edith Finch, if that
Nice.
makes sense.
That does, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I know we have a number of other Edith Finch fans on here, but yeah, and that thanks for sharing the connection it made with you as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So that was Will's fifth game, Edith Finch. For me, there were at least 3 that I like really wanted included in this last spot. So like for me, and thinking about life periods, like this last spot is more or less the modern period, the last 6, 7, whatever years. And the game I ended up choosing was Hades, which came out in 2020. And again, there are multiple other games I could pick, but I think this game kind of felt more appropriate as like a representative of this area for a couple reasons. One, well, first of all, I wanted to include an indie game for this modern period because I feel like that's been a real defining thing in terms of my gaming tastes the past 5 to 10 years. And I think Supergiant Games, who made Hades, has kind of been, in my mind, one of the, like, I mean, pioneer is probably not the best word. They were not the first people making indie games, but like, I feel like they were like all throughout the 2010s, like the ones kind of like making the types of indie games that like sparked my imagination and like really connected with me. Not that they were the only ones doing it, but like they've made 4 games now and all of them have been unique and ones I really liked. And Hades is my favorite of theirs, so I think it's like kind of a good representation of that. Hades is also an interesting one for me because I didn't really like run-based games much before Hades and roguelikes, and it kind of turned me around on that genre, and I think it does really, really great stuff with the way it treats its narrative within a run-based game. Like they really actually like thought about how you tell a story in a game where you're kind of running the same stuff over and over. But I think what really, like, if I had to point to one thing that made me go with this one as my final game is I've streamed for Extra Life for the past 6 years. I think this upcoming one is my 7th year in a row. And I kind of think of Hades as like, I don't know, kind of one of the best streaming experiences I've had of just running it, having people watching, like kind of cheering me on or whatever. And another aspect of Hades is early access. It's really the only game I've engaged with in an early access. So kind of have like all of these modern like things kind of coming together really well in Hades that haven't always worked for me in other games, but I really enjoyed the early access experience. And Extra Life 2019 was the first time I played Hades, and it was still in early access at that point. And streamed it all day, and my very final run was my first win. Ended up beating Hades like at midnight, which was a fun experience. And then of course kept following the game through its final release the next year, which came out during the pandemic as well. And it was like not the only great game that year, but it was my favorite game that year in the pandemic, which is also another defining event of the modern era. And I streamed it again a little bit that year, and it was kind of I have since like gone back and like watched footage of me playing it in 2019 versus 2020, and it's like both a lot changed for the game and in the world around me, and also I had clearly mastered the game from Extra Life 2019 was the first time I ever played the game, and like watching me play, I was like, oh yeah, I after playing this game on and off for a whole year, like it definitely improved. But and then yeah, like a lot of friends played it, and like sharing back and forth notes and builds and like things that happened in this just game where a lot of different events could happen, and it felt like the right. There's one other game I almost put on here, but for the spot, but Hades felt like the right game to kind of encapsulate this modern period of my gaming life. Is like a lot of different things coming together, and it's a game I played for the better part of 2 years on and off, and kind of constantly checking back in and updating, and of course it's also just like a really fantastic game that I think left a pretty big mark on me. So that is my 5th game, is Supergiant's Hades.
Yeah, Hades is awesome, and I can't think of a better encapsulation of like modern gaming. If you had to distill it down to one game, like it does really capture a lot about where games are at nowadays.
Yep. Yeah, it felt like the right pick for this era of like my gaming life, for sure. All right, so moving on, Paul, what is your 5th and final game for your console?
Yeah, so I'm going to say World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King. So that came out, I think, in 2008. which also corresponded to me graduating from college. When I graduated from college, I started working for the federal government, and my role was to be a traveling engineer. So I had grown up in North Carolina. I moved an hour and a half north to go to college, which is not exactly super far away. And then all of a sudden it was, hey, get in your car, drive to Atlanta. We're sending you to Memphis, Tennessee, all in the span of like seven calendar days. So that was a whole lot of change real fast. I got to Memphis and they said, hey, get an apartment, sign a 1-year lease, but you may be there for as little as 3 months, and then we'll send you somewhere else. So in essence, like, I pretty much walked across the stage to graduate, left everybody behind, and then was a good 13-hour drive away from home in like a week. So I had played WoW in college, off and on, and then I just sort of needed something comfortable. I needed something familiar, and I couldn't really, carry a lot of stuff with me because I was driving a 2003 two-door Ford Focus, which, for those of you that wish to Google that, not the largest car on the road. So I had my personal laptop. I had I reinstalled WoW. I picked up Wrath of the Lich King with like my first paycheck, or second one, and started to really get into that game. There's a lot of hours that we have in the day that maybe we don't realize. And when you're in a hotel room or you're in an apartment waiting for furniture to be delivered, a lot of those hours can be kind of lonely if you don't have people there to talk to. And again, this was 2008, right? We didn't have Discord. We didn't have voice chat the way that we do now. We had Ventrilo. That was the best thing that we had was literally TeamSpeak and Vent. That's what we called Ventrilo back in the day. So, other than and T9 texting, by the way, because I don't even know that we had the freaking original Droid come out or the iPhone 3GS at that time. So, I still had a flip phone. So, for me, it was I needed some community because all my friends were back in North Carolina. So whenever that expansion came out, objectively, it made WoW a much better video game, a much better MMO, and it got rave reviews, and I got into it pretty heavily. And, where I went in my job, I did make friends. I did start to build a social calendar in these places that I went to when I was on the road. I met my now wife on the road, right? So, it wasn't that I didn't ever meet anybody or I didn't ever talk to, the ATACS crew here, but, for a little bit there from 2008 to 2009, I'd get home from work and, what do I really have to do other than sit down and play WoW for a bit? And that was for a year. I think 2009 is when I picked up an Xbox 360 and we started playing Call of Duty. And that's when I started to really, talk to these guys a bunch more just through the Xbox, voice chat and stuff. But there was a solid year where for me, I would go to work and work was hard. It was my first job out of college. I would go back to my apartment or my hotel room and I would play WoW for an hour or 2 or 3, whatever it was, and then go to bed. Well, if you play WoW for 3 hours a day and then a few hours on the weekends, you end up becoming like I did, which was the number 1 DPS on the server for my chosen class and number 5 overall. So that's how you become a hardcore WoW guy. You just don't have really too many commitments outside of work. But it was a real sort of social connection for me for more than a minute there. I think if I went back on the road again, if I had to move away from Georgia for any reason, it wouldn't really fill that role because technology has advanced and time's marched on and we've got way easier ways to keep in contact with people than what we used to. But yeah, for a bit there, I needed something that wasn't a challenge. That I like WoW didn't really have a fail state. It wasn't like Fletch talking about Hades, right? It didn't have any sort of you could die, but it was so rare by the time Wrath of the Lich King came out that it's just checking a very comfortable box every day. And then I was online enough to get into a raiding guild. I made, some friends there, folks that I never really kept up with because that wasn't the style back in the day. But that was a game I enjoyed, but it was also a great comfort to me during a time of great upheaval. Garrison talked about moving around and finding that comfort in those certain spots. And that's where I found my comfort. Like I'm in a scary new city called Memphis, Tennessee that I had never been to before. And I'm staying in an extended suites America until I have enough money to get my first apartment because I need a certain amount of my bank for a down payment. And what do you do when you're in a hotel like that, waiting for life to kind of get put back together? Well, it turns out you sit down and you start playing WoW. And that got me through a lot of uncertainty, and it got me through a lot of sort of feeling disconnected from everything I had before. And I'll always be thankful to that game for the comfort that it brought during that particular time period. So, that's my number 5 by release date. But I do think that out of all the games that I have listed, WoW's probably the one that is the most important to me. Not that I'm going to go pick it up tomorrow and sink another 1,000 hours into it, but it was what I needed in a time and a place to sort of bring that emotional stability and give me something that I had seen before and something that made it a little bit easier. Because when you go from college to sort of the real world, that's an adjustment. But when the real world also includes a 13-hour drive away from everything you'd ever known and your entire social circle and your entire support group, yeah, that's an added complication. And WoW definitely helped, take some of that away. So yeah, that's my number 5, and in a lot of ways, that's probably my number 1. So yeah, really good game. They did a lot of good stuff there.
I obviously comfort can come from many things beyond video games, but I think it really does speak to the power of video games to just. I think video games are immersive in a way that maybe books or movies quite aren't, and just can be just a warm blanket to kind of bundle up in when you just need something and just get lost in and just not think about the real world for a while. So thank you for sharing that experience.
Yeah, thanks. And to expand on what Garrison just said, I think it's interesting that a lot of us have picked games that there's been community around, or we've especially in that college and post-college time, kept up with friends or formed friends or things along those lines, like Diablo and Smash Bros and StarCraft and WoW and these kind of online games that we've used to connect in those ways. So yeah, that's really cool. Thanks, Paul. All right, Nate, what is your fifth and final game today?
My 5th and final game has to be The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Because it is my favorite game of all time, probably, if I had to rank, but it also was just the reinvention of a series that I already loved into a fully new open world style that completely captured for me the sense of adventure of what a Zelda game is at its core. Just the feeling of looking out over the landscape and plotting out where you want to go next, and being distracted by a dozen things along the way, and finding little pieces of magic and humanity and history throughout that world. It was a very it felt like, as I was playing it almost from the start, like I was playing my favorite example of one of my favorite types of games. I knew it pretty much right away. So it's just one of those games that clicked all the way for me. I played it for hundreds of hours. I've gone back to it multiple times. and always feel that sense of like picking up my Switch and turning on Breath of the Wild, whether I'm starting a new file or just loading into wherever I happen to be on my current file. It is like going back to a familiar place. It's like going back home. It's just comfort. It's magical. It is just something that I can always turn to, even if I don't have the energy for anything else. The other thing I will say about getting the Breath of the Wild for the first time, they came out at the same time as the Switch, is I was working as a classroom teacher in high school, and I still work in a high school, but I'm not a classroom teacher anymore, and I was teaching game design classes, and I decided that I was going to go out during my planning period, which was second period at the time, and run over to Best Buy and see if I could get a Switch on release day, which they didn't open until 10, so it kind of lined up time-wise. So I got to the Best Buy, stood in line outside, watching the clock, hoping I wasn't going to be late for my next class that I was supposed to be teaching, and grabbed a Switch and took it back and opened it up and hooked it up to the projector, and our kids just my students just got to see the Switch and plug it up, and we turned on the game, and they saw the opening segment of Breath of the Wild, and I always remember like I let them run around in the game for a little while, which is on the starting area, the Great Plateau in the middle of the map. And one of them pauses and goes to the map and starts zooming out, and they're like, "This game's huge." Because they had been running around that plateau for like an hour.
And that's
and you
just
can
a
see
small part of the game.
You can see all the stuff, and it looks like you're huge, but you're just on like a little tiny part of the map. So it was like a fun moment of discovery together with this group of teenagers in that class. And then I, took it home and played it for hundreds and hundreds of hours. I remember that summer just playing it all the time. Had my Switch with me everywhere I went. That was not long after we had bought our first house, just like sitting out on the back porch in the summer with a Switch playing Breath of the Wild. It was like, man, this is just good living.
Life, you got it made. That's when you knew you had it made. Sitting on your back porch playing Breath of the Wild.
Yep. But yeah, that's my fifth game.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's one many of us like quite a bit. All right, we have one more game to go. Garrison, bring us home with your fifth and final game.
All right. Well, I think I'm done kind of dredging up like the teenage anxiety. So my last game that I picked is a game called Dark Souls 2.
Nice.
So this was also kind of my last game was kind of a hard one to pick. Because ultimately when I figured about like connecting games to relationships, like it all kind of led up to Smash Brothers Brawl. And then I'm like, oh, well, then what happened? And the answer is, I spent all of college playing Smash Brothers. And then graduated. My friends, we all went our separate ways. I went to grad school. And that's about the time that I just kind of like stopped engaging with games quite so much. I'm not a frequent person on this podcast, but I think a couple of times before I've alluded that I don't play games as much anymore. Games have a lot of nostalgia for me. I still enjoy games, but they're just not something I make a lot of time for now. And so I think like in grad school, like I went to library school and made friends. Instead of friends who talked about video games, we talked about libraries and metadata and classification information. So I didn't. Oh dear, drop my phone here. But I did get very into the Dark Souls game during grad school and during my first jobs. And I feel like those are games where you can still play with people, you can still play online, but the community aspect is very different than it was for Smash Brothers or for Pokemon Diamond. And Nathan kind of alluded to this when we talked about Demon Souls, but just the way you interact with people is very different. So I think games were still a bit of community for me, but just a very different kind of community where I'm a little bit more disengaged from the world of video games, from people playing them, but they are still games that left a pretty strong impact on me. They're definitely the games that I've encountered in my adulthood that I return to the most. And I enjoy like the whole Dark Souls trilogy, Demon Souls, Bloodborne, Elden Ring. But ultimately I picked Dark Souls 2, not because it's my favorite, because Dark Souls 1 is probably my favorite, but I do feel like my taste in video games is always just a little bit like off to the side of things. And Dark Souls 2 is very much a game that's just a little bit off to the side in terms of like mechanically, in terms of lore. It's just a bit funky. It's not as polished. But it also takes some really interesting swings that I do really appreciate. And I do think that speaks to like my taste in games, which is sometimes like just appreciating games that are a little bit funky in some way, but like, God bless them, they tried. And, you know, I feel like maybe that's a bit emblematic of me too, who's like, again, a little weird in some ways, but God bless him, he tries.
That's
Also, slinging lightning in that game before they nerfed it was the most fun I've ever had in a Souls game.
Nice. Well, I think Garrison, you have concluded us well here. All right, so we're running a little long on time, so we're gonna wrap up this podcast. This has been just really great, great little trips down memory lane and personal journeys. We are gonna do one more around the horn here. So everyone, recap what your 5 games were, and if you would like to give a name to this. If we can remember up top, the original premise, My Perfect Console, was we are kind of creating a console to, I don't know, that we want to immortalize with games that are meaningful to us. So if you want to give a name to your console, this is the time to do that. But yeah, recap your 5 games, give us a name on the console, and then we'll send this podcast home. So we'll keep the same ordering. So Will, remind us your 5 games, and if you want to name your console.
We got The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Diablo 2, Magic the Gathering Online, Cryostasis, Sleep of Reason, and What Remains of Edith Finch. And I think the through line, well, I don't know if there's a real through line there, but I think in terms of what I like now, I tend to like games that allow me to create a build. So I'll call my console the Build-A-Box. And yeah, that's it.
Nice, love it. All right, so that's Will's Build-A-Box. My console, to recap, I had Super Mario RPG, Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, Elite Beat Agents, StarCraft 2, and Hades. And yeah, my theme was kind of trying to just represent different eras of my life. I also, as a secondary theme, tried to get 5 different game genres, but that was pretty easy to do for me. But going with the theme of different eras, and also to reference Chrono Trigger's time-traveling spaceship, I will call mine the Epoch 5000, because there are 5 games on it, and adding the word 1000 just makes anything sound cooler. All right, Paul, remind us what's on your console and what would you call it?
Well, I have to change my name now because I actually had 5,000 at the end of mine. So I will just go through the games first. So I had Mario 2, the US version, Asheron's Call, Diablo 2, DDR, and World of Warcraft. And since the vast majority of those are PC games, I'm going to go with my console being named the Compact Presario SR1000. We'll just go with that.
Nice. All right, Nate, what is your console?
All right, I had Final Fantasy VII, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Sith Lords, Guitar Hero, Demon's Souls, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And I tried to come up with a name for this thing. I don't know that I have it. I was trying to come up with something that was like about like adventure or like like going on a quest, but then Guitar Hero throws the whole thing off. So it's the Rock Adventure or something like that.
The Rock
All right. All right, I can go with that.
I don't know.
All right. So, Garrison, what is your console?
So my console features Kirby's Dream Land 2, Dot Hack, Pokemon Diamond, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and Dark Souls 2. And hopefully those are all accurate things that I have talked about in these past couple hours. And my console name is Go See a Therapist.
That's freaking great, Garrison.
Well, I appreciate that. I personally struggle to name things. We've gotten some alternate names in the chat. It was suggested that mine could be called Repeat Beat, or that Paul's could be called DPS Train. Are some other potential names from the chat. But yeah, this was a... Sorry? Yeah, no, this was a really great talk. Appreciate everyone being willing to be on this. I think this was a really great activity. Thanks for Will for suggesting it, and thanks everyone for being so open, discussing all of these games and what they mean to you. This was really enjoyable. And I think with that, it is late and we should probably call this a podcast. This has been our My Perfect Console episode, inspired by a podcast called My Perfect Console by Simon Parkin. It's a very good podcast. You should check it out. Kind of a similar idea. And I've been Flex, joined by Will, Paul, Nate, and Garrison, and we are signing off. That has been another episode of the ATACS podcast in the books, and we will see you next time.